Good evening. My name is Michael Perlin, and I am so sorry that I am not going to be with you tonight. As you know by now, I was planned to come. I was so thrilled when Professor Scully invited me this past fall, made all my plans, got my plane reservations, had everything filled in. And of course, I got an email from United yesterday saying the flights to Tampa were canceled because of the snow. I'm in Trenton, New Jersey. There's about 22 inches of snow out my window, and there was just going to be no travel today. So I am doing this instead via YouTube. It's not as good, of course, as being in person, but I hope that it works as well as technology can work. If any of you have any questions, I'm so sorry, there will be no Q&A. If there will be any questions, please send them to Professor Scully, and she can send them on to me. It is really quite an honor for me to be chosen to give this lecture tonight. The title of my paper is this. It starts out with a quote, "Had to be held down by big police," end quote. I'll explain later where that comes from for those of you who don't know. A therapeutic jurisprudence perspective on interactions between police and persons with mental disabilities. It's a truism that the nation's largest urban jails are the largest mental health facilities in the nation. And most of the predictable solutions that are offered to curb the influx of individuals with mental illness into jails, especially those that urge the loosening of civil commitment standards and the return to large psychiatric institutions, are dreary at best, unconstitutional at heart, and mean-spirited at worst. Deinstitutionalization is seen as the enemy and as the raison d'etre for the current state of affairs. I don't think that's right. And I think Professor Sam Bagenstos, who teaches these subject matters at the University of Michigan, has the best of the argument. I'm quoting Sam here. To be sure, we could solve the problem of homelessness among people with psychiatric disabilities by simply institutionalizing them for the long term. But other policies could solve that problem just as well, notably supportive housing in which individuals obtain tenancy in apartments linked with supportive services. And yet, as homelessness was increasing in the 1980s, governments were cutting SSI and housing assistance, the very programs that could pay for community-based housings for persons with psychiatric disabilities. So that's kind of off to the side to begin with. But importantly, and I think this is really the crux of my remarks, we pay remarkably little attention to one of the primary causes of this reality: the decision-making processes on the street by police officers who choose to apprehend and arrest certain cohorts of persons with mental disabilities, often for what are characterized as nuisance crimes, rather than working with them and seeking other treatment-oriented alternatives. Such arrests fail to protect public safety when mental illness is at the root of a criminal act which is exacerbated by a system designed for punishment, not treatment, and it may actually exacerbate mental illness. Scholars agree the criminal justice system has been recognized increasingly as a threat to physical and mental health. And I should here interpolate just a little bit about me. Before I became a professor, I was a real lawyer for many years. I spent 3 years as the head public defender in Trenton, New Jersey. I spent 8 years as director of the New Jersey State Division of Mental Health Advocacy. So I represented persons with mental disabilities, both in the civil and in the criminal processes for 11 years. So I have a bit of background in this area. Just wanted to share that with you. We know that inappropriate arrests are caused by a variety of barriers to effective police response, including a lack of training, misconceptions about mental illness by the public and by the police making the arrests. In most jurisdictions, police departments do not provide any guidelines whatsoever, and certainly no clear guidelines, for interacting with people with mental illness. As a result of this, the police officer is left to his or her own devices to resolve the situations. And this becomes all the more important because of the substantial discretion that police officers typically have in handling certain misdemeanor cases, failing to obey an officer, failing to give a good account of yourself, creating a public nuisance like that. And dispositional decision-making very often depends on such variables as the publicness of the behavior. Is the offender a, quote, known neighborhood character? Did the individual behave problematically during the interaction. On the other hand, there is a robust, valid, and reliable literature that demonstrates that certain methods of training programs that are designed for police officers, what is called most notably the Memphis model of crisis intervention training, or CIT, to most well known, have resulted in dramatic reductions of arrests for such nuisance crimes and have avoided contributing to the over-incarceration of this population. In the Memphis model, each shift or patrol area or precinct is equipped with at least one officer who's a member of the crisis intervention team. And every member of this team undergoes extensive training in identifying symptoms of mental disturbances, utilizing nonviolent interventions, de-escalation techniques, and how to utilize all available community options. And critical elements that lead to a program being effective include intensive training, about 40 hours worth, voluntary participation, 24-hour-a-day availability of trained officers, and a lead officer with crisis intervention training on every team that responds to all mental health calls. And evidence shows that this training has led to an increased transport of persons who are experiencing a mental illness to emergency evaluation and treatment facilities rather than to jails. Unfortunately, courts have not been very supportive of arguments that such programs are required. In one case, a district court in Montana ruled a police chief's failure to provide crisis training and to have procedures in place did not result in the police officer's alleged use of excessive force on the arrestee, nor did it deprive the arrestee of his right to medical treatment after arrest, and then denied his civil rights complaint. In another case, the Eighth Circuit ruled an arrestee was not denied reasonable accommodations under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, because police failed to use crisis intervention training and used a stun gun against the arrestee, who went into cardiac arrest and died. So this is not a very good track record from our courts. We also know, and this is very important, and it's especially so because it contradicts so much of the false ordinary common sense about all of this. We know there is really much valid and reliable research that calls into question the entire criminalization as a result of deinstitutionalization hypothesis, a hypothesis that has never been rigorously tested. And in the review of the literature, Professor John Junginger and his colleagues state this: unless it can be shown that factors unique to serious mental illness are specifically associated with behavior leading to arrest and incarceration, the criminalization hypothesis should be reconsidered in favor of more powerful risk factors for crime that are inherent in social settings occupied by persons with severe mental illness, risk factors such as unemployment, poverty, homelessness, and substance abuse. In an earlier article, I raised a full range of factors that are ignored in the political discourse over this issue. So here are some points. While the proportion of persons with serious mental illness in psychiatric institutions has fallen by 23%, the percentage of incarcerated persons with serious mental illness increased only 4% in the last half of the last century. 2, many persons with mental illness are brought to jails rather than mental hospitals in the first place because of how much more time-consuming so-called mental hospital drop-offs are. 3, the evidence is clear. People with mental illness engage in so much of the behaviors in questions, not because of their mental illness, but because they are poor. And the strongest risk factors for violence are shared equally by those with and without mental illness. 4, we really know very little about the true prevalence of mental illness among offenders throughout all stages of the criminal justice system, or about the extent to which the needs of mentally ill offenders are going unmet. Next, there is some similar substantial and valid evidence and reliable evidence that where proper screening and placement procedures are in place, every resident of some of the facilities to which this population is being sent could be successfully placed in community settings. Next, there are staggering fiscal costs to this current state of affairs, and most importantly, there is no evidence for the basic criminalization premise that decreased psychiatric services explains the disproportionate risk of incarceration for individuals with mental illness. There is no research demonstrating that mental illness is a principal or proximate cause of criminal behavior for most offenders with mental illness. Of course, the empirical evidence that supports each of these assertions is utterly ignored in the media and in political debates. In most jurisdictions, police continue to over-arrest and over-jail persons with mental illness for nuisance crimes, and this crisis continues unabated. Any benefits that could be achieved by aggressive, proactive policing tactics are offset by serious costs to individual and community health. And I believe one possible solution to this is the adoption of policies that are consonant with the school of therapeutic jurisprudence. And this is something that has not been raised before. And I'll discuss later. Therapeutic jurisprudence, or TJ, offers a fresh and creative way to approach these issues, and I believe if it is embraced by policymakers, it offers a potential solution to what has for decades been an intractable problem. For the past 20 years, lawyers, forensic psychologists, criminologists, and scholars have turned to TJ as a new modality to try to solve a range of intractable social problems: mental disability law issues, corrections law issues, gay rights issues, domestic violence issues. TJ tells us that voice, validation, and voluntariness, all embracing an ethic of care, is central to any efforts to remediate the kinds of issues I'm talking about here. But there's been virtually no attention paid to the potential use of TJ as a tool to remediate this most serious of problems. I believe it should be so used. So in my talk, first I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of affairs of the over-arrest of persons with mental disabilities. Then I'm going to look at some of the alternatives like CIT that I've already mentioned, and then explain why embracing TJ would offer, I believe, a bold new approach to these problems, and then offer some conclusions. Now, my title, I told you, begins "Had to be held down by big police." Those of you who have heard me speak before, who've read any of my work, know that I very, very often begin my paper titles and my article titles with quotes from Bob Dylan's songs, both song titles and lyrics, and this is no exception. This comes from Bob Dylan's picaresque song, "When I Paint My Masterpiece," a song that depicts in part, and I'm quoting now from some of the music scholars, a modern world in unaesthetic chaos in which the narrator is unable to escape the shadow of his own personal history. In the verse from which the lyric comes, it is newspapermen who are innocently eating candy, being held down by big police. To the critic Clinton Halen, this reflects how heavy the burden of being the observer has become. In my talk, this burden is a heavy one for all society, but especially for those with mental illness who are treated in so many jurisdictions so inappropriately by police forces. I hope that this talk may lead to some changes in this set of circumstances. And before I go on any further, I should tell you that I've adapted this talk from an article that's going to be published soon, I hope, in the Fordham Urban Law Journal in a symposium on law, mental disability, and the community. And for those of you who are interested, you can read a longer version that's online for free download now at ssrn.com. Look up Perlin and look up Big Police and you will find it. So now I'm going to talk about the current state of affairs, what has happened, and how can we solve it, or at least try to solve it.